Hello, everyone, and welcome to our presentation on navigating the IRB. Just as a test, is everyone able to hear me? Okay, good. Just want to make sure before I get started here. Okay, and just before we get started with the presentation, I'd like to provide this information in case you are interested in additional support outside of this presentation. We do provide assistance with all aspects of the dissertations. So if you are interested in additional support outside of the webinar, you can use the information that you see here to get in touch with us and learn more about the services that we provide. So just to give an overview of what we will be discussing today. So first, we're going to go over a little bit of history behind the IRB and ethical review and the ethical principles that underlie that. We'll discuss what exactly an IRB or institutional review board is, and we'll talk about issues concerning considerations that need to be made when you apply and deal with the IRB. Different topics include privacy and confidentiality, the informed consent process, the assessment of risk, and different categories of review that an IRB application can go under. We'll also briefly talk about the different things that you should prepare for your IRB application. And then at the end, we'll have an opportunity for you to ask questions. So if you do have questions, we will be answering those at the end of the presentation. So first, let's talk about a little bit of history behind ethics review and the IRB process. Sort of the underlying foundation of ethics in research, at least in the United States, kind of started with the formation of the National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects of Biomedical and Behavioral Research, which was commissioned to essentially develop a framework for conducting and understanding the ethics of research. And the document that was produced as a result or by this commission is called the Belmont Report. And this occurred in the late 1970s in the United States. And this occurred mainly in response to, at the time, recent incidents of past unethical research. The biggest examples of those were the experiments conducted by Nazis in concentration camps, as well as the Tuskegee syphilis study in the USA. And so as a result of these different experiments and research studies that were just egregiously unethical, the National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects of Biomedical and Behavioral Research was formed, and they produced the Belmont Report, which basically serves as a guiding document for conducting ethical research. And in it, they outline 3 core ethical principles, and those are respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. And these principles form the basis around which research today is judged in terms of its ethical rigor and merit. So now let's talk a little bit about those principles and what they mean. So the first is respect for persons. Respect for persons refers to the fact that humans are autonomous beings and they are entitled to protection. And in the Belmont Report, they outline that we need to acknowledge that people are autonomous and that they can make their own decisions. And we need to protect those individuals who have diminished autonomy. And we'll talk a little bit about what that means in a moment. But for the first part, in research, we need to respect the fact that people are autonomous and should be in charge of making decisions for themselves. And individuals should be able to make informed decisions regarding their own well-being. And what this means in terms of research is that participants need to be free to participate voluntarily in research, which means that they need to understand the research before they agree to participate, and they need to be free to end their participation at any time. So participants need to be free to withdraw from the research, as well as being able to make an informed decision to participate. And what results from this, or what we do in order to uphold this principle, is primarily the process of informed consent. Researchers must allow for informed consent and provide participants with necessary information about the study before they participate. So this information that we give to participants usually consists of the purpose of the study, the expectations about what participants will do and experience during the study, as well as the potential risks and benefits of the study, just to name the basic parts of informed consent. So these pieces of information are crucial to give to participants so that they can make an informed decision to participate. And we'll talk a little bit more in detail about informed consent later on in the presentation. Then another part of respect for persons is protecting those individuals who have diminished autonomy. And so those may be individuals who do not have the proper capacity to make an informed decision for themselves, for their own well-being. Examples of such individuals would be people who are underage, or children, essentially. So children typically do not have the capacity to make a decision, such as or an informed decision to participate in a research study. So that's why research involving children requires extra special considerations and protections. Other examples would be prisoners or individuals who are institutionalized. Other examples would be people who have a cognitive or mental disability that would diminish their capacity to provide consent. So all of these are individuals who need to be protected, and we need to take special care in protecting those individuals if they are the subjects of research. The next ethical principle outlined in the Belmont Report is beneficence. And the core of beneficence is the Hippocratic maxim of do no harm. Research should not bring harm to participants. And what this ultimately means is that we want to minimize potential risks involved in research participation, and at the same time maximize the possible benefits of the research. So research involves a balance of the risks and the benefits. There will, of course, be risks in research. All research involves some risk. So it is possible that participants could come to harm in some way during the process of research, but it is on the onus of the researcher and all involved to reduce that as much as possible and to never intentionally harm participants. And so there are different ways or different types of risks that participants could encounter in research. There are risks to their physical or psychological well-being. So in biomedical research, for example, if participants are in a trial for a drug or a treatment, there may be physical or psychological risks associated with that. In survey research, there may be sensitive topics that, or research on trauma that could cause participants psychological distress. These are also risks that should be considered. And then there are also risks in terms of participants' information. So it's possible that the information that participants provide during a study could be breached. So a breach of privacy or confidentiality could be a possible risk in research as well. And we'll talk a little bit more about those things later in the presentation. The final ethical principle outlined in the Belmont Report is justice. And justice involves the question of who receives the benefits of the research and who bears its burdens. The core of the justice principle is that both the burdens and benefits of the research must be equally distributed. So, in essence, what this means is that there should not be certain individuals or populations who bear undue burden with the research for the benefit of others. So, in other words, we cannot conduct research that burdens one population for the benefit of another population. The population that bears the burden of the research should also benefit from the research. And populations also should not be exploited out of convenience or availability. The past experiments and research studies that were egregious ethical violations, such as the Tuskegee syphilis study, are examples of violations of justice. For instance, in the Tuskegee study, African American males were targeted for that study, even though the research was beneficial to other populations. And also, those individuals were not given treatment that was available for syphilis during the time of the study. So these were examples of how justice was violated. And it's a big reason why formal ethics procedures were instituted after that occurred. So that kind of involves the history behind the ethics review in IRB and the core principles of it. So basically, before the Belmont report, there weren't mandates for formal ethics review and research, at least in the United States. So as a result of that, we now have what's called institutional review boards, or IRB. And these are organizations at institutions that conduct research. So, for example, universities that oversee research projects and ensure that the research being conducted is ethical. So all research projects at these institutions need to be reviewed by the IRB to ensure that they adhere to the ethical principles that we just talked about. And so the IRB is responsible for approving or rejecting research or suggesting modifications to research so that it aligns with the basic ethical principles. And so now let's talk about the different issues and considerations that go into the IRB process. One is privacy and confidentiality. So a core part of ethical research is ensuring that participants' privacy and confidentiality is reasonably maintained. So privacy refers to participants having control over the extent, timing, and circumstances that they share about themselves. And so privacy must be protected in research, and there are different ways in which privacy can be breached in research. One example is through methodology. So, for instance, in things like observational studies or focus groups, where multiple participants are in a discussion with each other, there is a chance that participants could reveal information about themselves to others that is not intended. And another way this can happen is through questionnaires or surveys. So especially in research that involves sensitive topics. So participants may see research about a sensitive topic and may have concerns about disclosing information about themselves in regards to that topic. And this is a big reason why in the informed consent process, we need to explain the purpose and the topic of the research so that participants know, what the content of the study is, what kinds of questions they'll be asked, so they know that before they get into the study. And they also need to know that, during the study, they're free to not answer questions if they don't want to. If a certain question they feel they don't feel comfortable revealing that information, the participant needs to know that they're free to not answer those questions, and so on. And another aspect of this is confidentiality. So privacy has to do with how participants disclose information about themselves. Confidentiality has to do with how the researcher treats the information that the participant has disclosed. So confidentiality is the treatment of information that an individual has disclosed with the expectation that it will not be divulged to others. And so part of ethical research and the IRB process is demonstrating that you will use all the methods, appropriate methods available to ensure participant confidentiality. So this can be done in a number of ways. So the primary way is in how the data are collected and stored. So you always want to make sure that your data collection and storage process is done in a secure way. So if you are, for instance, doing an online survey study, you want to make sure that the platform that you're using to distribute the surveys is a secure platform. You want to make sure that when the data are downloaded and saved, wherever the data are stored, that those data are protected. If it's electronic, that can be done through encryption or password protection. If you're collecting physical data, such as paper and pencil surveys, you want to make sure that those documents are protected, so storing them in a secure place, for instance. Another way to ensure confidentiality is to remove identifying information from the data and assign participants identification numbers. If you are conducting qualitative research, you may consider assigning pseudonyms to your participants rather than using their real names. Another way to protect or ensure confidentiality is to make sure that any demographic characteristics are reported in aggregate form. So for instance, you should avoid reporting the demographics or demographic data of individuals. So for instance, saying this participant was, a female nurse who was 34 years old. Publishing that kind of information could potentially identify a participant. So instead, you want to just report demographics in aggregate. So saying, what percentage of your sample were women, what was the average age of the sample, and so on. Again, the IRB will require that information about the protection of privacy and confidentiality are outlined in your informed consent. So part of the informed consent process is telling participants how their data and their responses will be protected. So now let's talk more specifically about informed consent. Again, this goes back to the principle of respect for persons. This is the process of giving the participant the information they need in order to make an informed decision to participate in the study. Informed consent needs to be done as the first step when a participant enters a study. So before you apply any procedures, treatments, or interventions to participants, or before you collect any data from them, they need to provide their consent to participate. And so part of the informed consent, obviously, is the information that you present to participants about the study. This includes the study purpose. So the topic of the study, what the researcher wants to find out. The participant has a right to know what the research is about, the expectations of the study. So what participants will be expected to do in the study. So whether they're answering questions, whether there's anything else that they have to do, procedures wise, the types of questions that they'll have to answer, the types of information they'll be asked to provide. Those things should be explained in the consent. The potential risks of the study should be outlined in the consent form. So if the study is of minimal risk, that should be stated. If there are any risks beyond what's considered minimal, those specific risks should be outlined in the consent form. And if possible, you should explain in the consent form how those risks will be reduced. Another part of the consent form is assuring participants that their participation is voluntary. So there should be statements in the consent form that tell participants that the study is voluntary, that they can withdraw from the study at any time, that they can refuse to answer questions, and so on. The other part of the consent process is the documentation for participants providing their consent. So you need to give them the information to read so that they know about the study and understand it, but then you also need to confirm from the participant that they have read the information, they do understand the study, and knowing that they agree to participate. This can be done with the participant's signature or other kind of endorsement. In a face-to-face study, this would usually involve a physical document that participants read and sign. If it's an online study, it may just be a page of the survey that participants read, and there may be an item on that page that participants endorse to say that they've read the information and they agree to participate. And with informed consent, there are additional safeguards and protections and considerations that need to be put in place if the study involves participants who have diminished autonomy. So for instance, if you're doing studies with children or anyone who's under what's considered the age of consent for wherever region the study is being done in most places in the United States, that would be 18 years old. So if you have participants who are under that age, for example, you would need a special process for obtaining consent because minors and children cannot legally provide consent in those cases. So usually you would need to obtain consent from their parent or guardian, and often attain verbal assent from the participants themselves. So there are extra considerations and special processes that are required when you are dealing with those individuals with diminished autonomy. Another part of the IRB process is assessing the degree of risk in a study. So the risk is determined by the likelihood of experiencing harm and the severity of that harm should it occur. And it's worth noting that all studies are considered as having risk. It's just the degree of risk present in each study. So even a very simple and seemingly innocuous form of research, like an online survey, could involve some degree of risk because participants submit their information. It's possible that the data could be breached in some way, and their personal information or their responses could be exposed. to individuals outside of the study. So that's a risk that could occur. Some factors to consider in terms of assessing risk include the topic of the study. So does the study involve a sensitive or taboo topic? Does the study involve trauma? Again, studies that involve trauma, or if you're asking participants questions about things like trauma or perhaps past abuse, could have a risk of causing psychological distress in participants, for instance. Study procedures could be another source of risk. So again, if you're doing something like biomedical research where a participant is involved in some kind of a treatment, or they're taking some kind of experimental drug, then obviously there are physiological and psychological risks associated with that. Another source of potential risk is the population that you're studying. So there may be certain individuals who are more vulnerable to risks than others. We call these vulnerable populations, and they require special consideration when conducting a study. Examples of vulnerable populations would be those with diminished autonomy that we discussed earlier, such as children, institutionalized individuals, individuals who have mental disabilities or cognitive disabilities that diminish their capacity to provide consent. Other examples of vulnerable populations include individuals who are more at risk for physiological or psychological harm, participants who are severely economically disadvantaged, participants who have been past victims of trauma or abuse. Really, any individuals who have heightened vulnerability will be at greater risk in certain research studies, and procedures need to be put in place to make sure that these individuals are protected. All studies need to balance potential risks with expected benefits. So if the study involves only minimal risk, then there may be less that needs to be done to account for that, but studies with greater risk, or for studies with greater risk, rather, you need to be able to demonstrate that the expected benefit of the study outweighs that risk. So if you are, for instance, doing a study on a vulnerable population, or you are doing some kind of study where the risk of participants experiencing distress or even physical discomfort or harm is increased, you need to demonstrate that the study poses a great enough benefit to expose potential participants to that risk. The benefit needs to outweigh the risk in order for the study to be considered. And of course, the level of risk is examined and judged by the IRB. So the IRB reviews your study in terms of its level of risk and the expected benefits, and they determine whether the risks outweigh the benefits. And if not, then they need to determine if there are things that can be done to modify the study that would make it acceptable or ethically appropriate. or if the study just cannot be done. So now let's talk a little bit about the different categories of IRB review. This can vary by IRB and institution, so it's possible that your institution may have different or more or fewer categories than this, but these would be the three basic categories of IRB review. The simplest form is exempt. So this usually applies to studies that have no more than minimal risk. It involves the least amount of review. It may just involve a cursory review, or essentially just a desk review of an IRB member, and they would determine that the study does not pose more than minimal risk and is exempt from further levels of review. The expedited review is for studies that involve more risk, which may involve a higher level of review, but is still, it's usually called expedited in that it is a less involved process than a full board review. In a full board review, the IRB members convene to discuss specific studies that have been submitted. And after that meeting, they make the determination of whether the study is approved or not approved, or it needs changes. And so the main differences from the perspective of the researcher of these review categories are the amount of time these reviews take. So studies that involve lower risk will generally be reviewed much quicker. And they also differ in the amount of changes that may potentially need to be made to the study procedures. So studies that involve more risk, that undergo a higher level of review, will be scrutinized more and may require more significant changes. And the last part that I want to go over today is just a quick IRB application checklist. So this is essentially a list of things that you should compile or have ready for your IRB application, because these are all components that your IRB application will likely require or ask for. So having all of these kind of collected and ready to go when you are ready to submit your application will help you in the process. So first is you want to make sure you have the description and details of all of your recruitment procedures. So this would involve things such as copies of invitations or other recruitment materials. For instance, if you're doing some kind of a survey, if you have an invitation letter that you're sending out to participants over email, for example, the IRB will want a copy of that invitation letter so they can see its content. If you're posting flyers somewhere or advertisements for your study, the IRB will want to see copies of those advertisements. You'll also need permission letters from your recruitment sites. So essentially, if you are collaborating with any sites or organizations to recruit participants, you will need to demonstrate that these organizations have given you permission to recruit participants from their organization. So you should have all of those permission letters compiled ahead of time to include with your IRB application. And if you've already done your proposal of your dissertation, so if you already have your methodology chapter done for your dissertation, a lot of this information about your recruitment procedures should already be in your methodology chapter. And part of it will just be taking that information and putting it into your application form. Another thing that you'll want are the description and details of all of your study procedures. So this may include documentation for all instruments and measures that you use. If you're conducting something like a survey study, you want copies of all the survey instruments you're using, as well as permissions from the instrument authors to demonstrate that you have permission to use their instruments for your research. You also want just written descriptions of all of the study procedures. So essentially all the steps that participants will go through. If you're doing some kind of an intervention study, you want description of the intervention, what the process of the intervention is. Again, if you've already done your proposal and already have your methodology chapter of your dissertation completed, you should pretty much already have this information written out already, and it would just be a matter of taking it from your methodology chapter and putting it into the appropriate sections of your IRB application. Another component that you will, of course, need for your IRB application is a copy of your informed consent form. Many schools will provide a template for consent forms, so you may want to check your school's website, or maybe even the IRB website for your school to see if they have a template. If so, you can just use that template and plug in the information from your study into the template to create your consent form. But the IRB will want a copy of that in your application. And then the last thing that you'll want for your IRB application is proof of completion of research ethics training. So most institutions and IRBs will require that you complete some kind of ethics training course. One example of this, or a provider of such a course, would be Citi. Different institutions may have different platforms or providers for such courses, but usually this just involves going through, and it's typically done online, where you go through a series of modules and take quizzes, and basically you get a certificate to say that you completed research ethics training. This is something that the IRB will want to see proof of in your application. You also want to make sure that if the IRB requires your mentor or chair to complete research ethics training, that your chair or mentor is up to date on their ethics training. So that's just another thing to consider for your application. And so that brings us to the end of our presentation. So again, if you are interested in additional support outside of these webinars, you can use this information to get in touch with us and learn more about the services that we provide. But with that, I will now open things up for questions. So if you do have a question, you can go ahead and enter your question into the questions section or chat. Looks like no one has answered or entered any questions yet. I'll just give another minute or so in case anyone does have a question before we end the presentation today. Okay, question is, if students participating in the research take the regular assessment test for music and reading, will individual permission be needed for the students participate in research? That's a good question. So in a lot of cases, studies would be exempt, or it may be considered non-human subjects research. For one, if the data already exists and you are just accessing that data to analyze for the purposes of research. So this may be the case if the data that you're using comes from an assessment done in an educational setting that's done regularly. But it may also apply to certain situations for routine educational or diagnostic tests. In which case you may not need consent or permission from individuals to use that data for research. It's always best to ask your specific IRB in case it's not clear whether your research would fall under that category or not. Usually you would just go through the process of submitting the IRB application and describing your research and the process that you're going through to collect the data, and your IRB will tell you if the research is considered exempt or if individual consent is not needed for the research. All right, if anyone has any other questions, feel free to enter those in now. All right, it doesn't look like any more questions are coming in. Or one more question: what to do if the parent signed consent for under 17 years, but the child refused to be tested? So that would be in a case where you would get consent from the parent. So the parent provides consent, but you may also need to get what's called assent from the child participant, in which case, if the child does not provide assent, then you likely cannot include them in the study. but the IRB may be able to tell you more details about what happens in that particular situation. And again, it depends on your study in terms of whether your study requires parental consent in addition to assent, or if it just requires parental consent. But generally, if your study requires assent from the child and the child does not assent, then you would not include them in the study. And the question, how long does it usually take to get your feedback or approval from the IRB? This is not really a straightforward question to answer just because it can vary greatly depending on a lot of factors. It's going to differ, for instance, just by institution. It's going to differ depending on the level of risk involved in your study. So whether your study falls under an exempt, expedited, or full board review. If your study is exempt, for instance, you could get a response from the IRB perhaps in as little as a few days to tell you that the study is exempt and you're cleared to conduct the research. Other forms of review, whether it's expedited or full board review, could take weeks or maybe even a month or two, depending on how fast or slow that particular IRB moves, how often they convene, and so on. Because like full board reviews, because they involve an actual meeting of all the IRB members, they sit down and they discuss the different studies that have been submitted. They may only have those meetings like once a month. So in that case, it can take a month or longer to get a response if your study requires that level of review. Okay, so any other questions? Okay, so there are no more questions, so I'm going to go ahead and end the presentation there. So thanks everyone for attending the presentation today. I hope it was informative for you. Again, if you're interested in additional support, you can follow the information here to learn more about that, or you can go to our webinars page to look at past webinars or look at the upcoming webinars that we're offering in the future. And I hope everyone enjoyed the presentation and hope everyone has a great day.